All right. Hello. Welcome to our, you like how I switched mood there? Welcome to our Lunch and Learn. I hope everybody is doing well.
How about you muted yourself?
Let me unmute myself. Okay, so before we begin, I was mentioning that this might very well be a two-part conversation. So I'm going to be recording this class as well as subsequent classes. So if you can't make it to any of our lunch breaks, they will be recorded. All of the previous lunch breaks are now on our website. So I encourage you to go to it. We're going to be studying this text there. I just put it in the chat. You can purchase it for $1.99, $1.99. I think that's an eminently reasonable price tag for what I think is one of the most important theological statements of this century. And I have to be honest with you, reading it this morning again and taking new highlights, I think it's all the more important in light of the current situation that we find ourselves in with the pandemic. Dale just writes that she thought it was very interesting. I too think it's completely brilliant and fascinating. It comes from my teacher, Rabbi Gordon Tucker. Rabbi Tucker is the former rabbi of Temple Israel in White Plains. He is the former dean of the rabbinical school at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He is just a brilliant teacher, and I was blessed to have him as a professor during my time there. And he even talks about one of the classes that I took with him, which is his class on Spinoza. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get right into it. And what we are going to do is we're going to have a conversation about Jewish law, halacha, and meta halacha. What are the overarching concepts that undergird or sit at the base of or the foundation of our system of Judaism? So let me go now to share our screen and pull up Rabbi Tucker's piece. Okay, let me just correct this right here. All right, and here it is. Everyone can see it? Everyone give me a yes if you can see it. All right, so can a people of the book also be a people of God? All right, so that's the core question that Rabbi Tucker is going to ask. And if you can see on the top here, it comes, those are my scratch notes that I wrote back in 2008. And you'll see my 2007, 2008 is when it was published. That's right, Sandra. And if you can notice, second, you will see two overlays. You'll see my scratch notes that I have from 2007, 2008, and then my highlights, which I've put in this morning. So we're going to take us through. And the question is, can a people of the book also be a people of God? And what we're going to try to figure out here is how do we decide when how do we decide if something kosher or not kosher? How do we know if we are creating a community or creating a system of laws that is operating in God's will? And ultimately, how can we adhere to our system of laws and halacha while also giving space for a higher image or a higher notion of prophecy or God to still be able to impact our lives? All right, so Rabbi Tucker wrote this book, wrote this essay, gave this speech around the time that there were a lot of debates that were fresh around gay and lesbian rabbinic ordination, as well as other hot topics that Rabbi Tucker has been on the forefront of. He spent many a year on our Committee of Jewish Laws and Standards. And if you're interested in pursuing more information about that, I encourage you to read his article, which I put in the chat, as well as to go to the Committee of Jewish Laws and Standards, and you'll see different opinions written by him. And he bases this article, he starts by referring to Dr. Gerson Cohen as Rabbi Cohen, former chancellor of the seminary. And thinking about this class and what topic I was going to teach, I was tempted to go back to one of my favorite essays, which was given in the last century, which was called The Blessing of Assimilation, a provocatively titled essay given to Hebrew College, I believe in '68 by Dr. Cohen, in which he challenges the Jewish community to understand that the real blessings of Judaism have also come by our ability to adapt and adopt to whatever milieu we find ourselves in. But I actually think that this piece, which is sort of meant as an homage to Dr. Cohen is really on point with today, and I think cuts to the heart of the current dilemmas that we're having now, which is how do we uphold our Jewish sensibility, our Jewish identity, while also responding to the very real health crises that we have at hand that are preventing us from gathering. Okay, so he begins this by talking about his relationship with Gerson Cohen. I'm not going to read all of this because I do want to get through it. And Rabbi Tucker could certainly deliver it to you better than I could ever dream of doing it. My hope is to go through this so that we, all of us here in this room, can understand, what sits at the heart of his analysis and ultimately what's at the heart of how I think about Jewish law. Okay, so he begins talking about how he got to know the chancellor of the seminary and how the chancellor of the seminary was for him a real rabbi. Not just an academic. So he has here, Gerson Cohen was a rabbi at heart. He cared deeply about the rabbinic vocation. Okay, and in 1972, speaking to the Rabbinical Assembly, as he was assuming the chancellorship of JTS, Rabbi Cohen said, "Of one thing I am certain, if there is to be an American Judaism, it must be a halachic American Judaism. I will therefore encourage seminary students to study Jewish law more than ever." Okay, so that gives you a sense of the former chancellor's commitment to American Judaism. It has to have a halachic framework. There have to be some laws. There has to be, this is how we do things. It has to be a real system of jurisprudence. That's Rabbi Cohen's position, and that has always been the conservative movement's position as well. Okay, so, and he meant those words, and he meant them more than ever. And so Rabbi Tucker says here, he's invested some years working out philosophy of halacha as a way to both honor and please Dr. Cohen. And they have largely been inspired by the instincts he had concerning what Jewish law could be in our age and our conservative movement. And I think this is really, when we think about should we live stream or should we do all of these things, we have to think about what is the meta philosophy around how we're deciding this and how is this connected to our basic religious beliefs. Okay, so Rabbi Tucker goes on. It is no secret that in recent years there have been debates in our religious quarters about matters of halacha and of meta halacha. As a member of the Committee of Jewish Laws and Standards, I have found myself at the center of those debates. And so he has found a little frustration, as he writes here, that the debates, the deeper philosophical debates that have happened in the Committee of Jewish Laws and Standards are often reduced to popular headlines or tweets. And that it's nearly impossible to explain teshuva in 280 characters. And yet that's the nature of our world. And as a result of that, most of these decisions have happened either yes or no, pro-gay rights, anti-gay rights. It's often just put as a snippet without having any understanding or any possible insight into the deeper issues and the conversations that have really undergirded and really stood as the foundation for how we understand Jewish law. So, so he says, but to simply call all of, and so he talks about all of the different evolutions, for example, that the Committee of Jewish Laws and Standards, we've abolished the status of a mamzer. We've allowed liberal status with the gay and lesbian Jews. Simply to call any of these legal results liberal, according to Rabbi Tucker, amounts to a trivialization of what is truly a matter of the utmost theological importance. It's very important that we understand that. If you just say liberal, conservative, you're using a framework in a language that obscures what sits at the heart of the halachic system. You're obscuring it. And in fact, you're using a framework that's maybe applicable in our world at large, but actually just doesn't get to the meat of the conversation. Okay, so now he's going to go and talk about this philosophical dispute, and it is a rather old one, and it goes back to the time of Plato. Okay, and so Plato's assertion was that there are abstract realities and truths that lay beyond our senses and the subjectivity of our minds, right? This Platonic realm Even if none of us are philosophers, we have certainly perhaps familiar with that word, what it means to have a Platonic realm. There is a realm of ideas. And so I might be sitting on this particular chair at the moment. And yet in this Platonic realm, there is the perfect, pristine image or concept of what a chair is, that the truth of a chair exists beyond our senses and the subjectivity of our mind. They include such abstract concepts as love, or beauty, or virtue, all right? Those actually exist. And although in principle, these transcendent truths, we can maybe get at them by our human reason or understanding, for the most part, I can't show you love, right? It's really hard for me to do that. I can try to express it, but I can't quantify it for you here. But yet I believe it exists. It's true, in spite of my inability to show it to you. Okay, so who disagreed with this? Who disagreed with Plato? Well, dissenters have come throughout the ages, included the nominalists who insisted that there is no such thing, for example, as love, right? Those are just us creating a concept around this feeling that we have called loving, and then creating some Platonic ideal of love that doesn't actually exist. They said we can observe and study and catalog these relationships, but we can't legitimately speak of truths of love or beauty or other abstractions. Okay, other dissenters throughout the centuries have been empiricists, right? They stress, hold on a second, the empiricists, all right. They stress the value, of course, of experience. And then, of course, they're the legal positivists. Okay, and this is really where we're going to focus our attention in on. So the legal positivists formulated their own theories in this vein, okay? And they argued that there was no meaningful notion of natural law. There's no pristine, out there natural law, right? There's no objective justice in any abstract, transcendent sense. This is what the legal positives are saying. But only the observable reality of legal postulates that were posited and the rules that could be derived from them. He goes on to explain that, because this is a little dense. Just as positivists understood true in science to refer to only that which could be derived from observables, and ethical in moral theory to mean that which could be inferred from socially constructed ethical axiom, so did legal positive insists that lawfulness could only be determined by some immanent standard, right? The standard has to be produced by the rules of that legal system, which is positive and accepted. So in order to determine what is legal, we're going to have to base that based upon some constructed system. And there's no notion of what is or isn't justice in a pure objective sense, because there is no pure objectivity, because it has to come out of a built system. So he goes on, absolute concepts such as true or just or right, whether in science, ethics, or law, inaccessible, can't get at it because of a basic epistemological issue. We can't actually access truth without going through our subjective brains. So therefore, the positives say it's meaningless. Now, this tendency in human thought reached its apogee in the legal positivist school of the early 20th century, whose members famously insisted that only those statements that could, in principle, be verified either by logical rules or by empirical investigation had any meaning at all. All right? So if you couldn't prove it, if you couldn't use logical rules or a system, he says here in the Vienna circle, people would be so frustrated with you, they'd hold up a card that said metaphysic, that you had taken something with an M on it outside of the system, doesn't apply here, right? It's like you're trying to figure out how to play baseball and you're talking about marine life. Doesn't apply here. You're taking something from a completely different realm. Okay. Rabbi Tucker goes on. Throughout this centuries-long debate, those thinkers who remained inspired by Plato insisted that there were eternal verities that might well lie beyond our normal apparatus of sense, perception, and logic. Okay, so there are those of us, of which I'm included and of which Rabbi Tucker is included, who believe that there actually is a God out there. And that the presence or the truth of that God's existence is not really dependent on, can't be dependent on our normal apparatus of perception and logic. And he goes to Gödel, who proved this with mathematics. Through his far-reaching proof that there is no formal language, an axiom system that would allow us to derive all the true statements of mathematics. It took me about 5 times to read this before I understood it. So I'm going to try to go through it slowly with all of you. Okay. So true could no longer be considered a synonym for provable or demonstrable. Okay. That is, some things could be true, according to Gödel, even though they eluded proof. All right. Even though it eluded proof, he found that mathematical truths could be real even if we couldn't prove them. Right? Even if there's no formal language or axiom system there is no formal language and axiom system that will allow us to derive all the true statements of mathematics, right? We know certain things about math are true, but we just haven't quite figured out the things that we know to be true. Well, how can that be if the only truth that we can get is based upon a positivist framework? So Gödel's discovery has plausibly been put on the short list of the greatest intellectual achievements of the 20th century, though it takes some additional unpacking, which I will do forthwith. It certainly does. Now, he says it's possible to read Plato and study Gödel without missing their interrelation, and he said he did exactly that. And he was made to understand it only in graduate school. So here it is. The proof presented to the world by this Austrian logician taught us that even in the apparently straightforward, formalized world of numbers, a world that seems tailor-made for precision and completeness, our systems, our formal devices for discovering truth have their limits. This was unexpected and disquieting. The truly startling nature of it is captured by Rebecca Goldstein, who writes with an apparent intrusion of a term, intuition, seemingly more suited to the discussion of mysticism than to mathematical discourse. All right, so here's what Goldstein had to say. The formalists have tried to certify mathematical certitude by eliminating intuitions. Gödel had shown that mathematics cannot proceed without them. Right? It cannot proceed, that is, without intuitions of what is real, yet not given to full expression and demonstration by our humanly conceived and articulated systems. Goldstein sums it up. Our expressible knowledge is greater than our systems. Okay, so this is the idea of Goldstein and Gödel. We know more than we can humanly express. More exists than that which we can systematize. So the legal positivists, in holding up that card metaphysic, are excluding something important from the conversation. Okay, he's going to go on and explain this. Why did he spend time on this? Because although one might look at this as just a side curiosity in mathematics, it's a good deal more. It is a key moment in a centuries-long drama and debate between those who identify being true as nothing more than that which we can validly demonstrate in a humanly divided system. Maybe that's you. And those who believe in the reality of truths that are independent of any systems, but that may be seen to be true, albeit necessarily in less formal and more intuitive ways. You just know something to be true. As Goldstein reminds us, all that Gödel did was to give this old debate a mathematical setting and to give his Platonist intuitions a mathematical proof. So he has this Platonic intuition, and he's actually put it into mathematical terms. Okay, so he's now going to go into the realm of religion right here. All right, so we ask, is there such a thing as the will of God, right? So if we view this, are there ascertainable truths beyond, or are there truths beyond our ability to ascertain them? All right, so he goes on that Jeremy Bentham, one of the inspirations for the modern forms of positivism, wrote that there is no such thing as the will of God. We can only presume that God has a will. And the whole system is going to be based on that presumption. The direct inaccessibility of the divine will makes it, according to Bentham, unsuited to determine what is right. We can't really refer to the divine will of God because what you might think is the divine will is different from what she might think is the divine will, different from what they might think is the divine will. How are we going to determine what's right? So the vector rather goes in the other direction. That is, what our ethical systems, in Bentham's cases, of course, he was a utilitarianism, produce as right or just leads us to presume that this must be the will of God. All right, so we've created the system of halakha, of jurisprudence, so a system of laws in this country, and that system will allow us objectively, right? We've all have this system to get to the will of God. It's a little loosey-goosey if I'm going to try to appeal to God's will, because based on what? But still, beginning with the ancient prophets, this is Rabbi Tucker, this is him being a rabbi, there have been those who have held to the conviction that there is a divine will, and that our expressible knowledge about it may exceed our attempts to systemize what we know of it. And he talks about the prophet Amos, right, who challenged Amaziah's formalized conventional priestly apparatus and called out of the heavens the voice of God. Abraham Joshua Heschel, as a sympathetic interpreter of the prophets, was in this sense one of the greatest of the latter-day religious Platonists. But as it happened, religious and legal positivists, the interlocutors of religious Platonists, were the ones who took strong root in the religious world in the modern era. And it's important to understand that phenomenon as well. Okay, so we have two schools of thought. We have the Heschelian, Platonist school of thought. There is some objective truth that exists beyond the parameters of our halachic system. And then we have the legal positivists who say that it's meaningless because I could never express in objective terms what is that divine will. And so all we have is this system to determine truth. Those are the two issues. Now, 350 years ago, we bring ourselves to Spinoza. We don't have to go too much into Spinoza here, but there is one idea to which he is forever associated and which made his break with the Jewish community inevitable. That was the idea that Judaism was a system of law and not religion. For Spinoza, of course, it meant that with the end of all Jewish sovereignty and self-government 17 centuries before him, halakha lost all its context to give it meaning at all, right? We don't have any system to impose it on people. I can't punish you for not keeping the Shabbos anymore. So the rabbis have been irrational not only in retaining it, but in trying to develop it and refine it as much as they have. All right, that is Spinoza. He goes on. Stark and shocking perhaps, but how far-reaching was it? I have come to understand during our recent halachic debates that the fundamental significance of something that Heschel wrote near the very beginning of his book, Torah Min HaShamayim. Check this. It was Spinoza who injected into Jewish thought the idea that Judaism is not a religion, but a legal system. And this doctrine has been coursing through the body of modern Jewish thought like venom. Rabbi Tucker said, in fact, it has done exactly that. And it is of paramount importance for those of us who practice and teach religion to understand not only the consequences of this, but also to carefully consider our calling and our vocation at this exact moment in human history. Amen. For there is more to this history than just Spinoza. So he goes to Moses Mendelssohn 100 years later, who picked up this distinction set forth by Spinoza, that Judaism is law and not religion. He didn't, Tucker writes, accept Spinoza's conclusion that Jewish law is irrelevant, but he said and that halakha was still of significance to Mendelssohn as a Jewish code of behavior that could accomplish various crucial communal goals. But it was, in the end, legislation and not religion. All right, here's how someone put Mendelssohn interpreting the Sinaitic revelation as having commandments rather than having eternal truths for its content. Mendelssohn was obviously following Spinoza's precedent. Mendelssohn refused to accept Spinoza's thesis that the purpose of the Mosaic legislation was purely temporal and political. Right? That's basically Spinoza's claim. Yet in limiting revelation to its legislative aspect, he shared the Spinozistic point of view. It is this version of Spinoza's venom, as Heschel put it, that was, of course, picked up still later by early Reform Judaism in ways that Mendelssohn presumably would not have approved, Tucker writes. But there's also a rather surprising mirror image to what we find. And the mirror image part is fascinating here, and I think it really plays out in 2020. It's complicated, and I don't want to rush, so we'll see how long this takes. And so the opposite effect is, around the same time Mendelssohn was writing, there is a Rabbi, Yecheskel Landau, who was writing a rabbinic responsa in Prague. And one of those dealt with the question of whether religious discourse found in the literature to which we give the collective and imprecise name of Agada could be used to have any standing in halachic decisions. So can we use some of our myths or our legends of our rabbis? Might not technically be in the Torah or in the Tanakh, but they're Agadic material, all of these wonderful legends that we have in our tradition. Can we use those? Do those have some sort of legal valence, legal power to them? So this is what he writes. He writes, the literature of Midrash and Agada intend to focus on ethical principles. But that's what the Midrash and the Agada often focus on, ethics, and on the allegories and parables that they contain. All of these are the very essentials of religion, but they are not aimed at halacha decision-making, and therefore we may not infer from them anything of halachic import at all. Get that? The Midrash and the Agada, the values, the parables, the beliefs, that's the essential of religion, but we can't infer, we can't derive anything from them when determining halacha. Of course, this is very striking for Rabbi Tucker. That which is stipulated as being essential is declared to be irrelevant to religious law. But unlike in Spinoza's and Mendelssohn's take on this dichotomy, this version held that religious law really did embody all of God's will for how are we to live our lives always and everywhere, as opposed to how we may think or speculate by God. Right, let me say that again. Religious law and religion are in this view separate and distinct. We have religion, and then we have religious law. So we could say religious law and religious thought, maybe they're also two distinct. We've got wonderful philosophy and legends and stories, and then we've got the law, never to meet, right? So all of our beautiful stories, who we are as an expression, never actually meet how we determine the law. The formalized mechanism of law here granted exclusive recognition as the way to ensure behavioral conformity with the will of God, all right? So how do you keep the will of God? You keep the laws, but the will of God, well, that's distinct from the system of laws, okay? One cannot help reverting in one mind to the fundamental Talmudic story that epitomizes the deliberate transfer of religious authority from prophetic encounters to systematic workings of the system of halakha. So we studied this way back when we were meeting in person downtown on California Street. We studied the oven of Achnai. So some of you were with me for that session. I'm pretty sure Sandra was. The story, known generally by the name oven of Achnai and told in the Masechet of Bava Metzia, is far both too well known and rehearsed, and at the same time not well enough. He's going to come back to it further, but just for now, it's sufficient to remember that it's a 1,800-year-old concept, that when the systematic workings of halacha are in process, it is permissible, if not mandatory, to rule more direct and immediately heavenly encounters by declaring, as the narrative, as Rabbi Joshua said, Lo b'shamayim hi, it is not in heaven, where the it is referring not to Torah, but to the authority to effectuate the Torah's teaching. Remember that story? They're debating over this oven. The voice of God comes down and tells them they're wrong, and they shut the voice of God out. And they say, not lo b'shamayim hi. We don't determine if this oven is kosher based upon what God has to say, because God is not in this system of laws that we're working on here. Lo b'shamayim hi. And we have long used the idea that text and the exegetical conventions governing their application and not the prophets are our oracles. And yet what he notices from Yechezkel Landau is that it reflects something more, okay? And this is precisely the spinacistic venom to which Heschel calls our attention to. So there's a problem. It's an inherent problem that Tucker is pointing out when we think of Judaism merely as a system of laws, okay? For Landau told us that the sacred yet unformalized literature of Agadah comprises the essential of religion, he said. It embodies genuine religious thought, but that genuine religious thought, he then declares, was never intended to have any effect on the piskei halachot, on the decisions in religious law. One can, with no need of a well-developed imagination, picture an adherent of this compartmentalized view of halacha holding up a scarlet letter for A anytime anybody tried to say, but there's midrash that says this, there's midrash that says love anybody. No, it's not in there. No, can't do that. Okay. That's how the halachic system works. You can't really take higher values, ethical values, Aggadah literature, because it's not in the system. All right. That is, the attempt to bring not heavenly voices, but rather Aggadic texts into the quest after God's will was seen as a way of bringing heaven in through the back door. You should be able to see the family resemblance with all other forms of positivism. The halachic texts are positive to be the embodiment of the will of God. And thus, this is the straightforward statement from our teacher we've studied, Rabbi Joel Roth, who wrote, whether or not it is true that the Torah embodies the word and will of God is of great historical and theological significance, but of no legal significance. I'm going to read that again. Whether or not it is true that the Torah embodies the word and will of God is of great historical and theological significance, but of no legal significance, okay? Systemic validity within a carefully defined universe of texts and rules is deemed to be the very definition of religious truths, right? We have to be able to prove it. For all my esteem for Spinoza and his groundbreaking philosophical insights, Tucker writes, I have come to appreciate Heschel's grasp of how this 3.5-century-old heresy has come to poison modern religious thought. Here's how Heschel pronounced his verdict. To say that Torah is only halacha is to espouse a non-normative view, which literally means a view contrary to halacha. So it's a wonderful paradox that you can also count on from Rabbi Heschel. Okay, so now in recent decades, we've seen both Reform and at least modern Orthodoxy struggling mightily, each in its own way and from its own directions, to undo the toxic effects of Spinoza's venom that separated religious law from religious thought. And as conservative Jews, we are charged by Rabbi Cohen with creating a worthy halachic American Judaism. And we've been watching this dynamic from the sidelines, all the while missing its significance for us and for our vocation. Isn't that true? Isn't that true now when we think about the dilemmas, right? We've got the lenience on one side and the strictness on the other side. And those seem to be the only two choices that we're provided. And what he's trying to say is we have got a voice here. We just don't know how to use that muscle. And that voice is essential. And it speaks to Heschel. And it speaks to the classic dilemma and the venom that dates back to Spinoza, which decoupled Jewish religious thought with what it meant to create Jewish law. Conventional halachic thought reflects the positivist position, but it has fortunately not failed to attract some interesting polemics intended to call it into serious question, okay? So he goes through here. I just wanted to skip along a little bit. Chaim Soloveitchik notes in his Orthodox article, he says this has some support, not only from those on what might be perceived the left wing, but those in the Orthodox circles. This is a basic, Rabbi Landau's, Cheskel Landau's thought continues. Here's Chaim Soloveitchik, writes in 94. He had also taken a less than rosy view of this growing bottom line literature. They were creating a whole bunch of bottom line literature in halacha that just gets you to the bottom of what's doable and what's not doable. And he argues that it signified a shift from religious communities based in the subjective and less formal phenomenon of life and experience to religious communities based in objectivity and fixity of texts, right? Don't tell me where this law came from. Don't contextualize it for me. Don't contextualize my personal individual circumstance. Don't take into consideration what I'm feeling or who I am uniquely. Just tell me at the bottom line, can or can't I? Completely objective. However, as the curious term prophetic halacha in his title would indicate, Churlaw, this is this thinker Churlaw here, who Rabbi Yuval Churlaw published this book in an Orthodox setting in search of a prophetic halacha, basically asking Heschel's question, which was picked up on by Soloveitchik. Churlaw was bothered by something more than simply the transfer of authority from the lived experience and habits of religious communities to the canonical texts. Here's how he very astutely diagnosed part of the problem he was calling his own community's attention to. Prophecy was based on the personality of the prophet, whereas in the world of halacha, the names of halachists tend to give way to the names of their books, right? I've been talking about Yechezkel Landau. He's known as the Noda B'Yehuda, right? The Noda B'Yehuda. right? And then we have Yisrael Meir Kagan is the Chafetz Chaim, right? Our thinkers write books, and then we call them by the names of the book. But look, that he says sometimes this can mean that we're really the people of the books, and that the books, in essence, are people personified. But looked at from the other direction, it's a phenomenon that just as easily indicates the suppression of personality in favor of the published written word. We're losing the personality. And then to ensure that this point is not lost, he completes the lament by saying that halakha in our day unequivocally prefers the path of detail and normativity. And thus we must clarify why we behave in this way and why we give pride of place to halachic normativity over the general spirituality that could emanate from prophetic halakha. Now, Tucker is pointing this out because this is coming from Orthodox circles and is definitely questioning some deep-rooted positivist theory that exists in those circles. Now he's going to go to Rabbi Kook. So Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, in a broadside that he published in 1908, said, "Dear brothers, Torah sages and influential writers, we too have committed folly and sinned. We learned and researched, debated and developed, wrote and illustrated, but we forgot God. We do not hearken to the voice of the truthful prophets, to the voice of our sages." Right? We have forgotten to include God. We have this wonderful system of halakha, do's and don'ts. You can drive, you can light, you can't write, you can't do this. Not really about God. We have forgotten God. Jumping back to our own decade, the very same thought was being expressed by Moshe Habertal. At what point does legal reasoning abandon its essential point of origin and become instead an inert activity of definition, categorization, and distinction? Besides the fact that the explanatory power of the formal analytic model is limited, it also threatens to uproot the religious meaning of study of Torah. If the study of Torah is an analytic explication of former legal categories, however stimulating and brilliant it may be, in the end, it will lead those students who are thirsting for inspiration to an empty trough. It's kind of like breaking down baseball with ones and zeros and graphs. You miss the game. If you read our text with some scientific analysis, with graphs and charts, you lost all inspiration. It goes back to William James in 1902. Here's what James had to say when asked about, the critical musings. All of this is fanciful instantiation of the observations made by William James. Religious thinkers attract disciples and produce groups of sympathizers. When these groups get strong enough to organize themselves, they become ecclesiastical institutions with corporate ambitions of their own. The spirit of politics and the lust of dogmatic rule are then apt to enter and to contaminate the originally innocent thing. When a religion has become an orthodoxy, its day of inwardness is over. The spring is dry. The faithful live at second hand exclusively and stone the prophets in their turn. Right? That is basically James telling you how these things develop. We have an inspiration, a group of people are inspired, and then they create a system to make sure that they protect that, and as a result of that, future prophecy is banished. James's paradigm turned out to be true here as well. The authority once granted to prophecy by Deuteronomy was in short order claimed by the majority in this original innocent successor culture that we now call Rabbinic Judaism. A more stable way of experiencing God, uncorruptible by unregulated individual claims, right? Eldad and Medad can't really survive Eldad and Medad any day, right? So we all remember and celebrate what we think of as the headline phrase, Lo b'shamayim hi, it is not in heaven. It's upon us to decide how we should behave. But let's not forget that the story of the oven of Achnad begins with a foreshadowing note that this was going to be an event in which the majority not only prevailed, not only ruled that an attempt to give God's will a voice was irrelevant, but did so by reducing dissenters to lifelessness in the same manner as the crushing power of a boa constrictor. Here we have the tyranny of the majority that is not going to allow you to make any claims that don't fit into the system. The too well-known story is indeed not well known enough, is what Tucker has to say here. And so in modern times, the halachic positivists, which is to say all of the halachists, okay, hold on, I lost my train of thought, which is they have strengthened and extended the ancient ban on theological thought, all right? So pretty much CJLS isn't gonna, oh, you know, we found this prophet in Atlanta, we should listen to them and change our halachic system. So we're not really gonna operate in that fashion. But here, Rebecca Goldstein says, and I think this is perfect, precision becomes the positivist analog to prayer, right? And so we've replaced the appeal to a God who is on high, and we have replaced it with precision. All right, so let me fall back up here. Except that now with a complete separation between religious thought and religious law, that is now mandatory. What was once a ban on the divine voice has evolved into a banishment of all of our Agada. It's as if we hold up a red olive for Agadah whenever we refer to any of those in a halakhic argument. But I trust that you can now see that Rabbi Tucker was talking about Gödel was neither irrelevant or self-indulgent. We need to remember what he demonstrated about mathematics, because it surely must be also true for human knowledge more generally. All right. There are inevitably truths greater than those that are humanly conceived and designed formulations can capture for us. As given in the quote of unknown attribution by Soloveitchik, there is music that is better than any that can be played. Certainly we know that is true, right? Isn't there some music that is better than any we can be played? So we should not vulgarize the legal debates in our movement by calling them simply left versus right or accommodators versus traditionalists. It is deep and important and indeed religiously crucial theological and philosophical debate. It's a matter of meta halakha, a word that is misused and misunderstood. Meta halakha is not a conveniently chosen ethical or social theory that trumps halakha, as it has been characterized. Nor is it a reverence for history, however noble, that is meant to inspire fealty to a legal tradition. Metaphysics studies the boundaries of physics, and that includes inquiries beyond those boundaries. Meta halacha is likewise an inquiry into what the limits of the halachic systems are as generators of religious truths. The Platonists among us insist that there is a real religious presence, greater than that which can be expressed even by the venerable, hallowed, and beautifully structured systems that we call halakha. Do we believe in a divine will that can be accessed even informally and without exactitude and completeness? Or is it only and forever a presumed divine will? One that is positive, that resides solely in what our legal rules and precedents produce. That is the question that divides the religious Platonists from the religious positivists. And I think that that is actually a divide that is very prominent at the moment with what is going on at the CJLS and the definition of the conservative movement at this exact moment. And this is where you can see I've scribbled all next to it a dozen years ago, and I've highlighted it really large now. Rabbi Tucker, I am willing to stake my rabbinate, as I believe Gerson D. Cohen did, on the claim that there is a real transcendent divine will, and that although we cannot know it with certainty, with which we know a precedent or a system rules of syntax, if we ignore it, we become a people of the book alone, a people of the text alone, of clever and ingenious legal moves only, but not also a people of God. If we ignore it, we thereby announce our satisfaction with the relatively easy quest for halachic validity, rather than pursuing the harder but more beautiful, more fulfilling, more sacred quest for religious truth. And to confine our system to systemic validity alone is to doom ourselves to religious incompleteness. Was that beautiful? I really think that, I mean, that really sums it up for me. All right, so I think we're gonna get through this whole thing here. So is there a remedy? Is there a path ahead? We naturally turn to those aware enough of the problem to lament it in order to get some antidote to the venom. He has Rabbi Cherlow, who says we must more and more inculcate the idea that halacha does not encompass the entirety of the Jewish vision. We have to say that there is more here at play here. Here's Rav Kook. Rav Kook had something to say about this as well. In 1914, The radiance of prophecy will re-emerge from its hiding and reveal itself not as an unripe fruit, but as the first fruits of vitality and life. And prophecy itself will acknowledge the great efficacy in the work of the sages, and in righteous humility exclaim, "The sage is more important than the prophet." This transcending of one-sidedness will vindicate the vision of unity, and the soul of Moses will then reappear in the world. All right, so I need a little explanation. Rabbi Tucker is going to give me a little explanation of Rav Kook. Two things are crucial here. First, there is the rejection of one-sidedness. This is a vision of prophecy that concedes the importance of halakha, right? We're not going to put any label on it, but we're just not the type of Jews that say, well, follow your bliss, right? We still have halakha here, and we're not just going to brush it aside. But it is a vision of prophecy that at the same time stands its ground and insists on the indispensable role in completing the religious life. And second, it's not a vision of a single prophetic figure, but rather a spirit of prophecy, which I take to be a vision of the possibility of a collective intersubjective prophecy. Right? It's one we can all arise at together. And it is the collective and intersubjective quality of it that both opens a door to a more complete religious life and avoids the unstable and idiosyncratic interruptions into religious discipline that forced ancient prophecy to die, right? And he says this is no esoteric theoretical matter. This is what they're trying to figure out when the Committee of Jewish Laws and Standards sits around the room and everybody says the halachic system, history, judgment on gays and lesbians was not one that anybody was happy with. Even those who resisted change and resisted still professed heartache over it. What was expressed in those words was the very same intuition. Right? That intuition that Heschel is talking about, that Goldstein is talking about, that Gödel is talking about. That intuition, that very same intersubjective, not idiosyncratic or weak-willed vision, born of sacred narratives that binds together all of the so-called liberal rulings. Right, the liberal rulings. There's something great. These aren't just liberal rulings. The legal inclusions and reinstatements of women, mamzerim, agunot, gays, and lesbian was not some succession of circumstantial accommodations to a liberal society. We should not view them that way, but rather a product of intersubjective intuition, a collective apprehension that the will of God cannot approve to the exclusion and disabling of sincere moral people, right? Be they women, victims of vindictive spouses, or gay. But in the midst of this collective apprehension of what seemed right, most accepted what they saw as their obligation to set that intuition aside. That's right, they sat around that room to determine what they can do, but you got to stick God aside. Lo b'shamayim. Stick that intuition aside. Stick that midrash. Stick that agadah. Stick the Kadosh Baruch Hu up in the heavens. I know we might really feel this way, but you just can't allow that in. It was, at least for the moment, the triumph of the positivists who ascribe religious significance only to that which can be derived from the system and rules all else out. Appealing to a prophetic vision, even a collective intersubjective one, only made matters worse because prophecy is a really bad word. It is true that a people of the book, of the text, achieves a measure of certainty, right? Orthodoxy, people of the book, can refer to it. We can have this measure of certainty. But has such a community achieved a glimpse of God, Rabbi Tucker asks, and what God truly wants of us by ruling out the collective religious intuition? They have, I submit, resigned themselves to an incomplete loaf by failing to admit the necessary incompleteness of our systems, hallowed though they be, to capture the infinite real essence and will of God. They have sentenced themselves and the communities that they lead, we might even say the movements that they lead, to existential incompleteness. Existential incompleteness. He goes down and he says, famously at the end of that story, we love the part at the end of the Oven of Achnai story where Elijah the prophet goes up to ask God, what does he think about this not in heaven, lo b'shamayim he, right? And God smiles and says, right, my children have defeated me. We studied that together. But terrible things happen in the sequel, right? The story goes on, including the death of Rabban Gamliel, who authorized the ban. And by ban, Tucker's saying a true ban, not just merely Rabbi Eliezer, but rather the banishment of the divine voice. In light of these terrible things, the divine smile could only have been a sardonic one. And the phrase accompanying the smile could be just as easily translated, my children have attacked me. The divine smile, in other words, could only be reflecting God's knowledge that the children in his story have not, in fact, attacked or defeated God. They have attacked and defeated themselves because they have put themselves on the road to religious incompleteness that will handicap them for as long as attempts to help us hear the divine voice are systematically silenced. So he then closes with the words, of course, of his teacher, Rabbi Dr. Gerson Cohen. And quotes from Proverbs, which says, Bechol diarechecha da'ehu, which is with everything that we have, we should seek to serve God. I believe that this verse is telling us that we must experience God in every ramification of our lives. Only then will life derive its meaning from values of ultimate significance. Only if we make it the central principle of our lives to experience the presence and the word of God in every area of our being will we be able to overcome the fragmentation that threatens to overwhelm us. How do we begin to approach this ideal? We must begin to teach our people to understand that in the synagogue, they can express only a distillation of the experience of God. An experience of God does not mean exact legislation for every contingency. This is the Gerson Cohen who wrote of the passionate religious mentality inherent in the Song of Songs. Gerson Cohen was a religious Platonist. He believed in a will of God, and he believed that it outstripped all of our human systems. And Tucker says he understands it better now than when he did his students. And I think I understand this paper from Rabbi Tucker much better now than I did when I was his student. And so now he gives Gerson Cohen the last word. So in 1980, months after his deep disappointment at the tabling of the ordination of women at the seminary, he spoke, as always, to his congregation, the rabbis of the Rabbinical Assembly. And he spoke prophetically of the crucial need for rabbinic prophecy. And here's what he said. I refer frequently to a verse from Psalm 119 that Maimonides used as the superscription to his Mishnah Torah. Az lo evosh ba'habiti el kol mitzvotecha. Only when I contemplate the totality of the tradition can I hope to attain religious fulfillment. Not everything we do is a fulfillment of the divine will, but everything must be measured by the divine will. And divine will. And everything is either a response to or a retreat from it. I am worried about only one thing. Do we look as we believe we should look in terms of the most authentic interpretation of our heritage? You and I are rabbis, and he who fails to live up to his designated role is kovesh rabotenu, a suppressor of his rabbinate. He suppresses his charge and withholds the message entrusted to him. He is thus a man who fails in his religious duty. Tucker concludes, this is not about failing in religious duty. It is about rediscovering our vocation. It is about having the self-confidence and commitment to find Rav Kook's principle of unity and to make ourselves into a people of the book and a people of God. All right, so that is it. That is one of my favorite and I think most important pieces of theology written in this century. Right now I have some notes here in the chat. All right, okay. All right, I have some notes. Does anybody, we have 5 minutes. Does anybody want to ask any questions? Or would you like to just save the questions for next week? I see there are a whole bunch of, I've got Dale is raising her hand. Ben Chin is raising his hand. Ben, yeah, sure. Randy, I'm happy to keep going.
I think I was with you until we got to the remedy. And I don't get what the remedy is here other than just, rejecting the idea that halakha is all there is. I don't see where the religion, where he bridges
So
this
I'll proffer one now.
between
I'll
the
proffer
religion and the
one now.
halakha.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if I should answer that question or if I should let it stand. But I will say that I think there is a place for the voice of prophecy, and he wants that voice to return. And I think perhaps, and this is me going above my pay grade, okay? I think that the argument could be made that we're so in our heads about this halachic legal system that we can understand the Shabbat by tapping with our elbow instead of what sits at the heart of the Shabbat. We've obscured our system to such a degree that Shabbat can be tapping the left elbow instead of tapping with the right finger, or that we can obscure whatever the Shabbat is through some twisty, what does it mean for a Zoom, or what does it mean for this? And we've lost that basic notion of Amos, who's shouting to the king saying, you've lost the Sabbath here completely. And I think what Tucker is saying is that we want to create space for that prophetic voice to speak up. Other thoughts, other questions? Irene.
It almost bringing this up as a discussion, to me, minimizes the inspiration of God, because what does it really matter? The loss came later, I would think, in order.
And this is, yes, no, Irene, this is what William James pointed to in his Varieties of Religious Experience. This is the dynamic, and it's classic. It's classic. It's an American religious thought. It's all over history. Somebody has an inspiration, all right? A shaman or whatever has an inspiration. They're able to grapple with some drama that is going on in their day and age, and the shaman is going to be successful to the extent that the shaman's solution or framework speaks to the drama that's being held by other people, experience that, speaks to their generation, develops a group of people that are inspired, that inspiration, want to hold on to that community of inspiration. The next generation write a series of laws to make sure that it isn't lost. And then the subsequent generation says, these laws are too restrictive. I don't feel any inspiration anymore. And it's repetitive. And then that subsequent generation will go up to Woodstock, right? 300,000 strong, to find their own inspiration, because the parents' inspiration was too rigid, even though they experienced it in a very real way 30 years prior. And they created a system of rigidity in order to make them feel whole and protect their community. So this is repeated. And then, of course, the baby boomers then, systematize what it means to be, whatever that, a hippie or whatnot. And the thing repeats itself. And it goes on. Stuart Bletcher had his hand raised.
Yeah, Ben raises a very, very good point, and I didn't really understand the problem I had with Tucker's piece, but Ben really clarified it for me. It would be better had Rabbi Tucker called his piece, Why You Should Believe in God, because I think 50% of the conservative Jews who would read Rabbi Tucker would say, well, that's not really relevant to anything I believe, because I don't believe in God, but I think I'm a good conservative Jew. And I agree with 99% of what Rabbi Tucker said. I disagree with the emphasis he placed on the existence of God. Throughout his entire piece is the following assumption. The assumption is someone who reads this believes in God. And that's just a fallacy. That's a failure on his part.
Yeah, I think what he's saying, and by the way, I would attribute any failing to me, not to Rabbi Tucker. He is a genius of this generation. So the failing is mine. I think what he is trying to say is that ultimately there are two schools of thought. They're either we're going to put the system by positing that there is the existence of God, and we're going to use that presupposition to undergird our halachic system of jurisprudence. And we don't know if God is real or if God isn't real, but it's a nice presupposition that we can use in order to have this halachic system. And beyond that, I can't say anything else about God. I just can't, because what can I say about God? But it's a nice presupposition to undergird my halachic system. Then there are the people who say, nah, there's still God. God has got to be more than that presupposition. God has got to exist in a greater way than anything that we can express. And when we limit God exclusively to being that presupposition in our halachic system, we lose out on prophecy, on spirituality, on large values, and on love. All right, I have time for one more thought and one more question. Bert, is that you raising your hand?
Volume.
Wait, hold on.
Oh, am I on?
Yeah, we got you now, Bert.
Okay. Well, to put it in a somewhat simplified and secular context, in Anglo-American law, there is this concept of equity. So we have a rigid legal system which has answers to everything, but in situations where it just doesn't seem right,
You got it.
Classically, we go to equity. And that's what I see this as a parallel to.
Yeah, I like that. I think that would be the similar framework that he would find here, that there's some truths, right? Someone probably, we might have a legal case in which the letter of the law says that a person should go to jail, but there might be extenuating circumstances that for whatever reason don't make it into the court case or don't fit into our system of laws that the judge should be able to give heart to. So thank you everyone for engaging in this. This is no easy task. I'm kind of amazed that we got through it all in 1 hour. I definitely want to continue this conversation with all of you. So if you have further questions, the link for the article, I recommend you purchasing it. It's only $1.99, and if we're going to pay $1.99 for a CD, the least we could do is pay $1.99 for a piece of amazing theology like this. I encourage everyone to purchase it. Send me questions about it. I'm really glad that it came up in my thinking this past week, because I really think it helps to crystallize some of the challenges and issues that we have now. And I wish you all, this Friday, another announcement. This Friday, to celebrate Juneteenth, we are going to be having a wonderful concert Friday at 4 of the Fraternal Order of the Society of Blues, followed by, which is an inspirational song of old music from 100 years ago dealing with liberation. This was the concert that we had scheduled for Passover, which unfortunately was postponed, followed by a great L'chaim conversation. And tomorrow evening, as part of our summer prayer list, we're going to be kicking off our Talmud study with our scholar in residence. Hopefully you had an opportunity to meet him, Rabbi Dr. Noah Bickert, who used to be a member of the Committee of Jewish Laws and Standards, and he's going to learn some Talmud with us. Some people have been asking us over these past few weeks, I want to learn some Talmud. So Rabbi Russell is teaching Mishnah on Monday morning, and Dr. Bickert, 7 p.m. tomorrow night, is going to be teaching Talmud, and he's going to be teaching Masechet Yoma, which is really practical because he's going to be going through some of the Talmudic ideas about what sits at the heart of our high holidays. So join us for all of that. I look forward to seeing you again very soon, and have a good day.
I tried to buy that, the text, and
Yeah.
to sign in as a rabbi.
Oh, okay. Email me, Deborah. Email me. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.